There are stories that shake you to your core, but then there are stories that leave you breathless, trembling, and questioning everything you thought you knew about trust, betrayal, and power. And this is not just another Hollywood scandal. This is a tale of manipulation, of lies, of rights stolen, and reputations destroyed, a story so dark, so twisted, so shocking, that once you hear it, you will never look at Colleen Hoover Blake, Lively, or Justin Baldoni the same way again. The storm began quietly, like all storms do, hidden beneath polite smiles and glowing interviews, where everyone pretended to be allies working for the same dream. The dream of turning a best-selling novel into a film that could captivate millions, but beneath the surface. Behind the polished words and carefully arranged photos, there was tension brewing, and the world had no idea that what seemed like a creative collaboration was in reality a ticking time bomb. Colleen Hoover, the author who rose from obscurity to dominate bookshelves across the globe, a woman who built her empire on stories of pain, survival, and resilience, was at first the grateful partner to Justin Baldoni, the actor and filmmaker who had admired her work long before social media made her. A household name, he believed in the story. He believed in its potential to spark conversations about cycles of abuse and healing, and he even saw himself as the man who could bring its male lead to life. Colleen encouraged him, cheered for him publicly, and supported his passion. But somewhere along the way, that support shifted. It twisted into something colder, darker, more calculating. Whispers began to spread that Colleen was no longer satisfied with her arrangement, that she regretted selling her rights too quickly, that she watched Baldoni gaining momentum and control, and feared that she had given away her most precious creation too easily. The book that had made her a phenomenon was now slipping from her grasp, and the thought of another reaping the profits and the glory sent waves of resentment through her once friendly demeanor, and in that resentment, a plan began to take shape. At first it was subtle, a suggestion here, a hint there, an alliance carefully nurtured with Blake Lively, an actress of status and influence who shockingly admitted she had not even read the book before being cast, yet wielded the kind of Hollywood power Colleen now craved. Blake became not just the star, but the wedge, the instrument through which Colleen could dismantle Justin's standing. What had once been a partnership was soon poisoned by doubt, betrayal, and ruthless ambition. Reports began leaking that Colleen was standing firmly behind Blake, even as rumors painted Baldoni as difficult, even dangerous, and the narrative shifted so fast it left fans spinning. Was this the same Justin who had championed the story for years, who had spoken with reverence about its message, and now suddenly he was the villain and Blake the victim? It was a transformation that felt orchestrated, deliberate, like a script written long before the public realized it was being performed. Colleen abandoned the neutral stance of a creator, grateful for her team, and instead threw herself behind Blake, praising her as kind, patient, brilliant words that cut sharp against the silence she reserved for Baldoni, the same man who had once carried her vision, the same man now being erased piece by piece. And the more fans looked, the more disturbing the puzzle became. Colleen deleted her social media pages right as criticism peaked, dodging questions about her choices, about her son's allegations, about her bizarre decision to release a coloring book based on domestic trauma, a decision so tone-deaf it had sparked outrage and mockery. What was she running from? What was she hiding? Her exit from the public eye only fueled suspicions that there was more behind the curtain than anyone dared admit. And in the middle of this storm, Justin was being dragged through the mud, accused, diminished, left to watch as the rights he had fought for seemed to slip away like sand through his fingers. And as for Blake, she tightened her grip, making aesthetic changes, imposing her will and shaping the project into her own playground, while Colleen stood behind her, clapping, smiling, distancing herself from the man who had once been her ally. The betrayal cut deeper than fans could process, because this was not simply about creative disagreements, it was about power, about control, about the very heart of a story, rooted in cycles of abuse, being exploited, twisted, and corrupted by the very people who claimed to honor it. Fans who had once worshipped Colleen Hoover began to turn their backs, calling her a hypocrite, a manipulator, a coward who vanished when accountability knocked on her door. They accused her of scheming, of using Blake as her weapon to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. They saw in her decisions not the actions of a woman fighting for art, but the cold strategy of someone hungry for dominance. The internet exploded with threads, posts, and videos, each one peeling back another layer of deception, pointing to her sudden launch of a production company, pointing to her high-powered law firm, pointing to her smiles beside Blake and her silence toward Justin. pointing to the morality clause buried in contracts, a clause so sinister that it appeared to explain everything if Justin were accused of sexual assault. The rights would return to Colleen instantly. The timing of Blake's allegations suddenly seemed less like coincidence and more like the activation of a trap carefully designed and cruelly executed. The dominoes fell with terrifying speed. Justin, dropped by his agency, his reputation shredded, his role diminished. While Colleen emerged untouched, unscathed, aligned with Blake, and shielded by Hollywood elites who knew how to bury stories and silence questions, fans screamed betrayal louder and louder each day as receipts surfaced and timelines aligned, and the story no longer looked like chaos. It looked like choreography. The author who once told readers to break the cycle of abuse was now accused of enabling it, of silencing a teenage girl who claimed her son hurt her, of blocking victims, of defending her family while ignoring her values. The fall from grace was catastrophic, and yet Colleen remained composed. Calm, calculated, every move too perfect to be random, every alliance too convenient to be chance, and the world began to wonder, was this truly an author caught in the storm, or was she the architect of the storm itself? Because how else could the puzzle pieces fit so neatly? How else could Blake speak so confidently about sequels that legally belonged to Justin? How else could Colleen launch a production company mere months before the collapse? How else could she secure powerhouse lawyers right before the allegations surfaced? It was not chance. It was not coincidence. It was betrayal weaponized. It was manipulation dressed in charm. It was a trap set long before anyone realized they had walked into it. And in the center of that trap stood Justin Baldoni, bloodied, bruised, abandoned, and betrayed, while Colleen Hoover and Blake lively smiled for cameras, pretending the chaos was not carefully manufactured, pretending the world was not watching as reputations, lives, and legacies were destroyed before our very eyes. And with each revelation, with each leak, with each silence from Colleen, the world understood that this was not just another Hollywood scandal. It was the unraveling of trust, the exposure of greed, the proof that even the storytellers who claim to stand for truth can themselves become the villains. In a tale darker than fiction itself, the silence from Colleen Hoover grew heavier by the day, and in that silence the whispers became louder, darker, more insistent that this was no accident, no misunderstanding, but rather a deliberate dismantling of a man who had dared to believe he could protect the story he loved. Fans began to uncover old interviews and casual comments, moments that seemed innocent at the time, but now played like carefully staged foreshadowing. When Blake lively hinted during a CNN interview that she would do a sequel if Colleen had the rights, even though the rights belonged to Justin and Wayfarer Studios. It felt less like a slip of the tongue and more like an unveiled truth, a quiet signal that plans had already been drawn up behind closed doors. And Colleen sat there smiling, her calm demeanor betraying no shock, no correction, as though she too knew the ending long before the first scene had even been shot. It was the kind of moment that, when revisited under the light of hindsight, feels chilling too, convenient, too rehearsed, too clean. The more people examined the timeline, the more impossible it became to believe this was coincidence. Colleen launching Heartbones Entertainment right before everything imploded. Colleen hiring a powerhouse law firm representing Hollywood giants like Johnny Depp and Brad Pitt right before allegations surfaced. Blake stepping into interviews with the confidence of someone who already knew where the power would land. And then the morality clause hidden inside Justin's contract, like a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. That clause was the smoking gun. A clause stating that if Justin were accused of sexual assault, the rights would automatically revert to Colleen Hoover, and suddenly, the entire scandal crystallized into a story of premeditation, not chaos. Colleen was not stumbling. She was orchestrating. She was not retreating. She was advancing quietly, methodically, ruthlessly. The morality clause meant that all it would take was a single accusation, not proof, not conviction, not even corroboration, just an accusation, and the dominoes would fall in perfect alignment. The studio would retreat, the agency would abandon Justin, the media would seize the narrative, and in the middle of the wreckage, Colleen would be standing with the rights in her hand, and Blake at her side, smiling as if justice had been served, when in reality betrayal had been weaponized as strategy. It was too precise, too brutal, and yet it worked exactly as designed. Justin was smeared, abandoned, cast out as whispers of misconduct, drowned out years of work, years of passion, years of dedication, and fans began to ask who truly benefited from this destruction. The answer was obvious. Colleen and Blake together, a pair of unlikely allies whose interests aligned so perfectly it could no longer be ignored. And then came the receipts, Colleen deleting her Instagram on January 22nd. The very day Justin's attorney announced subpoenas would begin pulling digital. Records into court fans saw this not as coincidence, but as panic, as desperation to scrub history before it could be unearthed, to erase evidence before it could become proof. And still Colleen played the victim. She vanished into the shadows, leaving her followers without explanation, her readers without comfort, her critics without accountability. While the internet pieced together the puzzle with chilling efficiency, fans on Reddit unearthed a post allegedly written by someone from the crew, months before the public drama broke. The post detailed how Blake had already threatened Sony, claiming she would expose harassment unless she was given more control of the project. And that revelation aligned perfectly with how events unfolded. Sony buckling, Blake gaining power, Justin being silenced. It was all there, written out before the curtain even rose. And if that post was true, then this was not only betrayal, it was blackmail. It was the exploitation of morality and outrage for the sake of greed and control. And once again, Colleen was positioned right at the center of it all, ready to reclaim her work, ready to profit, ready to stand beside Hollywood power, while a man she once called partner was obliterated in the court of public opinion. And the deeper fans dug, the darker the picture became, because this was not just about professional betrayal. This was personal. Colleen, the author who made millions writing about abuse and survival, stood accused of ignoring the pleas of a real teenage girl who claimed her son assaulted her instead of compassion. She blocked the girl instead of responsibility. She dismissed the story as twisted instead of standing for victims. She defended her own while turning away from someone who needed her most. The hypocrisy was unbearable. It cut through her carefully crafted image like a knife. Fans could no longer reconcile the woman who told them to break cycles with the woman who enabled silence in her own home. And so the backlash grew fiercer, harsher, louder. Colleen was no longer the queen of book talk. She was the hypocrite, the manipulator, the woman who sold values for profit and power. And Blake was no longer the beloved actress. She was the usurper, the schemer, the woman who had not even read the book before seizing it. The woman whose influence bent the studio to her will, whose lawsuit struck like lightning at the precise moment a morality clause could be triggered. The story turned into a labyrinth of lies, betrayal, and manipulation. And through it all, Justin Baldoni remained silent. His silence louder than words, his absence heavier than speeches. He was the ghost at the edge of the scandal. The man who loved the story too much to see how it was being weaponized against him, and the tragedy of his downfall only fueled the fire. Fans could not look away, because every twist revealed another layer of deceit, another moment where friendship had been traded for ambition, another knife planted squarely in the back of a man who thought he was safe. And in that realization, the audience understood that this was no longer a story about a book becoming a film. It was about how power poisons everything it touches, how trust becomes the first casualty when greed enters the room, how morality itself can be turned into a weapon if the stakes are high enough. Colleen Hoover, once untouchable, now stood exposed, her empire cracking beneath the weight of hypocrisy and betrayal. And the world realized that the story was not ending. It was only beginning, because if Colleen and Blake were capable of this much in the open, what darker secrets still hid in the shadows, waiting to be revealed, waiting to unravel, waiting to drag them both deeper into the weight of betrayal pressed heavier as new revelations began to surface. And what once seemed like a simple story of professional disagreements now resembled a labyrinth of deception, manipulation, and ruthless ambition that spiraled deeper with every passing day. Fans who once defended Colleen Hoover with blind loyalty could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that she had not only betrayed Justin Baldoni, but had also aligned herself with the cold, calculated power of Blake Lively, whose presence in the project became more sinister. With each uncovered detail, reports began to circulate that Blake had not only pushed for control on set, but had demanded aesthetic dominance, changing wardrobes, lighting sets, and even dictating creative choices that should have belonged to the director. Yet Colleen praised her endlessly, showering her with compliments as though the author herself was desperate to stay in the good graces of Hollywood royalty. And the more she praised, the more Baldoni's silence became suffocating, because his absence, his inability to defend himself, his erasure from the narrative screamed louder than any accusation could. The morality clause that once appeared as just a contractual footnote now loomed like the ultimate weapon, a weapon that had been unsheathed at precisely the right moment, triggered by carefully crafted allegations that decimated Justin's career in a matter of days. Fans began piecing together the sequence like detectives. In a crime drama, they saw how Colleen launched Heartbones Entertainment, how she switched to Powerhouse Lawyers, how Blake's lawsuit aligned with the contract clause, how Colleen vanished from social media the very day subpoenas threatened to drag her history into the light. It was not coincidence, it was choreography. Every move, every silence, every praise, every deletion lined up like notes in a symphony of betrayal. And what stung most for fans was the realization that the woman who had built her empire on the pain of others was now profiting from her own manipulations. The coloring book scandal, once dismissed as a careless misstep, now looked like part of a pattern of exploitation tone, deft decisions, and ruthless profit-chasing that spit in the face of survivors who once trusted her voice. The teenage girl who claimed Colleen's son assaulted her became the embodiment of hypocrisy. Proof that Colleen would defend her own at any cost while silencing others. Proof that the themes of abuse and trauma she claimed to honor in her books were nothing more than tools for fame and fortune. And as this hypocrisy grew clearer, the outrage online turned savage, calling her manipulative, cold-hearted, a fraud whose career was built on lies. Fans who once sobbed over her novels now burned them. Fans who once celebrated her book signings now called for boycotts. Her fall from grace became a spectacle, one as dramatic as any plot she had ever written. And through it all, Blake Lively thrived, standing tall as the Hollywood face of the project, smiling in interviews, shaping narratives, leveraging her influence and reputation, while her own controversies lay buried under the mountain of chaos surrounding Colleen. And Justin, some began to whisper that Blake had not only manipulated Colleen, but had also engineered the perfect storm to place herself as the heroine, the savior, the star of a story that had been drenched in scandal. Others argued that Colleen knew exactly what she was doing, that she willingly handed Blake the sword, and together they struck at Justin until there was nothing left but ashes. The truth may never be known, but the devastation was undeniable. What was supposed to be a story of healing had become a story of destruction. A project that was meant to empower survivors had become a machine that destroyed reputations and careers. And still the internet dug deeper. Fans unearthed timelines connecting Blake's influence to Ryan Reynolds' financial backing. They found connections between Colleen's legal team and Hollywood elites known for burying scandals. They uncovered how Brando Slenner, who played Atlas, seemed eerily aligned with Blake's side, as if promises had been whispered to him behind closed doors, promises of brighter futures if he stayed loyal. And the picture grew darker, more twisted, more disturbing with every piece of evidence, because this was no longer just a scandal, this was a heist, a takeover, a carefully calculated plan to wrestle control from Justin Baldoni and crown Colleen and Blake as the victors. Fans watched in horror as receipts surfaced, showing how Sony sided with Blake after threats of harassment exposure, how Taylor Swift's music team swooped in, how editors were replaced, how chaos reigned on set like a storm designed to push Justin out. And every time Colleen smiled, every time she praised Blake, every time she disappeared when questions grew too sharp, it became clearer that she was not the victim, not the bystander, but the architect of her own empire rebuilt on betrayal and manipulation. And yet, even as the outrage burned, even as Colleen's name was dragged across every platform, there remained a chilling calm to her silence, as though she believed she would outlast the storm, as though she knew that Hollywood has always rewarded those who play the game without mercy. Fans speculated that her rumored retirement was nothing more than another tactic, a retreat into the shadows until the smoke cleared, a pause until the next move could be made, because Colleen Hoover was not finished. She was not done. She had tasted the power of Hollywood. She had seen how quickly outrage could fade, how fast scandals could be buried, and how easily narratives could be rewritten with enough money, influence, and time. The betrayal of Justin Baldoni was only one chapter. The manipulation of fans, only one twist. And the question that now haunted everyone was simple. What darker secrets still waited to be revealed? What new betrayals still lingered in the shadows, and how far would Colleen Hoover and Blake Lively go to ensure that the empire they had stolen would remain theirs no matter the cost? And as the dust begins to settle, the wreckage left behind is undeniable. Careers, shattered reputations, burned bridges turned to ashes, and trust forever broken. Yet the silence still echoes louder than words, because even in the face of overwhelming evidence, even in the face of betrayal, manipulation, and hypocrisy, The players at the center of this storm refuse to admit guilt, refuse to show remorse, and that refusal leaves fans with nothing but questions. Questions that gnaw at the heart of every person who once believed in Colleen Hoover, who once admired Blake Lively, who once trusted Justin Baldoni, and now those questions spiral endlessly. What was real? What was manufactured? Who was the true victim and who was the true villain? Was this tragedy the product of cold calculation or desperate survival? Or perhaps it was both, tangled together in a knot so tight it may never be undone. And as the outrage simmers, as the headlines fade, as Hollywood spins its next dazzling distraction, the scars remain etched into the memories of those who watched it unfold. Because this was more than a scandal. It was a revelation, a brutal reminder that the faces we admire, the stories we cherish, the stars we place on pedestals can hide shadows, darker than we imagine. And maybe that is the most haunting truth of all, that in this glittering empire of fame, power, and fortune lies our currency. Betrayal is strategy, and silence is survival. And though the story may close here for now, the fear, the suspicion, and the unanswered questions will never truly end.